Hello, I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. I and Kathy Gillespie, Constituting America's CEO, welcome you to our annual 90-day study. 90 plus 90 equals 180. History holds the key to the future. This is our 13th annual study, and we would like to thank Amanda Hughes for orchestrating these studies. This year's study is on America's principles. Today's essay is essay number 7, Classical History and Significance of Republican Government as Adopted by the United States and Its Influence During the American Revolutionary War. Guest essayist Jay McConville. Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. John Adams. Republic or democracy? A distinction with a difference to the American Revolution. People often use the term democracy when referring to the United States. The distinction between a republic, which is technically what we are, and a democracy seems lost on those who intermingle the terms as if they were synonyms. If you note that we are not a democracy but a republic, you risk being mocked as strict constructionist, overly wedded to technical definitions, and unwilling to acknowledge the importance of popular sovereignty and the will of the people in our system. This is unfortunate, as the question of whether we are a democracy or a republic is an important one, complex, and reliant on clear definition of words and their use. Strictly speaking, the United States is a representative republic, not a democracy. The distinction has a difference. It greatly influenced the American Revolution and arguably saved the future republic from ruin in its darkest days. First, some definitions. Merriam-Webster defines democracy, a noun, as, quote, a government by the people, end quote, characterized by, quote, rule of the majority, end quote, and as, quote, a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation usually involving periodically held free elections, end quote. This, of course, does a pretty good job of describing what most of us believe our government is. We, the people, are sovereign, and we exercise that power through elections. So far, so good. As for republic, the definition is similar, but with several important additional elements. Republic is also a noun, meaning, according to Merriam-Webster, quote, a government having a chief of state who is not a monarch and who in modern times is usually a president, end quote. And, quote, a government in which supreme power resides in a body of citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by elected officers and representatives responsible to them and governing according to law, end quote. From these definitions, it is clear why there might be some confusion. A representative republic uses, quote, democratic means, end quote, to manifest the consent of the governed. We vote for representatives who vote on measures. Voting is democracy in action, but that does not make the United States a democracy. The measures that our representatives vote on are constrained by law and the Constitution. We do not have a pure democracy or, quote, rule by the majority, end quote, because we have constitutionally protected rights that cannot be voted away, operate under rule of law, and have, till recently, limited government with limited powers. We also have, however, an expanded voting population that is not limited by aristocracy, wealth, property ownership, or gender. Any citizen over 18 years of age can vote. One could say, therefore, that the United States is a democratic representative republic. While some might wish to believe so, the founders did not invent the concept of consent of the governed, nor was America the first democracy or republic. Discussion of such concepts had been going on for centuries, and republics existed prior to the American Revolution. What the American founders did do was expand the definition of a republic so that it gave more power to the popular will of the people. They were merging more completely the idea of a law-based government with the concept of consent of the governed. While in retrospect, we see their efforts as woefully incomplete, for the time it was a revolutionary step towards popular sovereignty. Many doubted such an expansion of representation could work over such a large population or territory. The original text of the United States Constitution never mentions the word democracy and only mentions republic as a form of government. Once, in Article 4, Section 4, quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government," end quote. Interestingly, that clause refers to the states and not the federal government itself. Throughout the text, the founders referred to the United States as the, quote, "Union," end quote, or as, quote, "United States," end quote, but never a republic or democracy. The Declaration of Independence does not use either term at all. That said, the structure laid down in the Constitution contains the elements that Merriam-Webster described, including a, quote, "chief of state," end quote, and that power lies with a body of, quote, "elected officers and representatives," end quote, who vote on the laws that govern the nation. All these officials govern according to law. That is republic, no doubt. When asked by, quote, Mrs. Powell, end quote, upon the passage of the Constitution in 1787 what we had created, Ben Franklin famously replied, quote, "A republic, if you can keep it," end quote. It is in the phrase, quote, "if you can keep it," end quote, however, where we find the true impact of the distinction between republic and democracy. As Richard R. Beeman, Ph.D., writes, quote, "We find ample evidence of that democratic revolutions do not inevitably lead to national harmony. We see that the expression of the popular will can create a cacophony of discordant voices. In far too many places around the world today, the expression of the, quote, "popular will," end quote, is nothing more than the unleashing of primordial forces of tribal and religious identity, which further confound the goal of building stable and consensual governments," end quote. While Franklin was concerned about, what he was so prescient about was the difficulty in preserving the Union. That concern was not an idle one, as the Revolution had proved. To keep the Union together required a structure that limited conflict and cooled the passions of the mob, yet provided ample enough rights and liberties to both the citizen and to the former colonies to make them support and adhere to the Union. Again, quoting Beeman, quote, "The question that has plagued all nations aspiring to democratic government ever since, how to implement principles of popular majority rule while at the same time preserving stable governments that protect the rights and liberties of all citizens," end quote. In 1776, a stable union did not exist. What did exist was a loose confederation of militia forces and citizens from the 13 colonies, operating under an ill-defined structure to which their commitment continually wavered. Support for the revolution was not, by any means, universal within these colonies, and the debate between revolution and compromise with Britain raged. To preserve the effort, the founders knew they had to promise both protections from mob rule and protections for popular sovereignty. This was not a trivial endeavor. Alexander Hamilton wrote of the challenge in a letter to John Jay in November 1775. In that letter, he addressed, quote, "passions of men," end quote, which provided for a great danger of fatal extremes, end quote. Hamilton wrote, "When the minds of these are loosened from their attachment to ancient establishments and courses, they seem to grow giddy and are apt more or less to run into anarchy. In such tempestuous times, it requires the greatest skill in the political pilots to keep men steady and within proper bounds." Hamilton was concerned about conflict between New York and New England, which threatened a united stance vis-a-vis England. To control intra-colonial conflict, he argued against too much popular sovereignty, an example, too much democracy. He recognized the need to hold the passions of men at bay and the skill needed to do that while continuing to keep the support of the colonies. As the war against Britain intensified, George Washington was plagued by irregular support from both the colonies and the Continental Congress. His ability to avoid catastrophic defeat is legendary. What perhaps was his greater brilliance was the ability to hold the forces together, keep the states from fighting each other, and channeling the passions of his fighting forces away from each other and towards the enemy. As his letter to the colonies from Valley Forge attests, the distributed nature of the Revolutionary Coalition put the future of the war in great jeopardy. Quote, "In a word, the united and respective exertions of the states cannot be too great, too vigorous in this interesting work, and we shall never have a fair and just prospect for success till our troops, officers and men, are better appointed and provided than they are and have been." End quote. Washington knew very well that a citizen force of volunteer militiamen responded only to popular will, while appealing to the revolutionary impulse was no substitute for a centrally commanded, resource-trained, and managed force of professional soldiers. Once launched, support to the war had to be controlled by a chief executive and protected by a Congress of Representatives whose laws mattered and lasted. Counter to popular legend, it was not the Minutemen who won the war. Washington could never have achieved victory had he remained subject to the democratic vagaries of 13 colonial assemblies guided only by majority rule. Quote, "Military necessity required American leaders to change their perceptions of standing armies and challenge their Republican ideals of volunteer part-time military service. Ultimately, it was the Continental soldiers that would secure victory." End quote. That the colonies agreed to the creation of the Continental Army is a critical component of the success of the Revolution. It is also remarkable given the antipathy they held against standing armies. James Madison, years later during the debates over the Constitution, exposed that antipathy, stating that, quote, "Standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty," end quote, and that the, quote, "means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instrument of tyranny at home. Armies kept under the pretext of defending have enslaved the people," end quote. Yet despite that view, such a force was authorized by the fledgling republic, saving the effort and leading to victory. Today, when a riot or mass protest occurs, people in the crowd can often be heard chanting, quote, "This is what democracy looks like," end quote. In a way, they are correct, which is why we are a representative republic. John Adams famously wrote in a letter to John Taylor in 1814, quote, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy, yet that did not commit suicide, end quote. In the same letter, he wrote, quote, the Athenians grew more and more warlike in proportion as the Commonwealth became more democratic, end quote. The founders, students of history, and great thinkers knew the distinction. That they did saved the new nation. Our founding was saved by the skill of, quote, political pilots, end quote, to craft a compromise between popular will and the rule of law. We are democratic, but we are not a democracy. We, the people, are those whose consent is required, but the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We would never have made it otherwise. Jay McConville is a military veteran, management professional, and active civic volunteer currently pursuing a PhD in public policy and administration at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs, Virginia Commonwealth University. His studies focus on improving health outcomes through food assistance policy. Prior to beginning his doctoral studies, he held multiple key technology and management positions within the aerospace and defense industry, including twice as president and CEO. He now works as a personal trainer and works to improve health and fitness through both his work and study. Jay served in the U.S. Army as an intelligence officer and has also been active in civic and industry volunteer associations, including running for elective office, serving as a political party chairman, and serving multiple terms as president of both his industry association's Washington, D.C. chapter and his local youth sports association. Today, he serves on the operating board of directors of Constituting America. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Government from George Mason University and a Master of Science in Strategic Intelligence from the Defense Intelligence College. Jay lives in Richmond with his wife, Susan Olsemer McConville. They have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Thanks for joining us today. Please share the word, spread the word about this wonderful study on America's principles. And don't forget to check out last year's study on American exceptionalism defined. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again tomorrow for Essay 8.